Okay, so to continue with our discussion of specialist areas, we talked last time about media relations, right? And this is where we left off talking about different kinds of framing. The next thing we're going to talk about, we were focused on the external, right? The media. Now we're going to turn it completely the opposite direction and focus on internal, which is employee communication. So I chose these two topics because they seem opposite in many ways, and really they are as far as external and internal. Key takeaway, though, that I want you to get right off the top is that they're both incredibly critical for organizations when it comes to an audience. So it's interesting because the organization society relationship makes a lot of sense when we think about the media because they communicate with members of the general public. But then for employees, we oftentimes think about them as internal, right? Like as if they're sort of siloed within the organization. They don't communicate out. And that just is absolutely untrue, especially nowadays. So the lines between internal communication or employee communication and what's external are blurred, if not completely gone. And so the employee is a really important stakeholder internally for an organization to think about because oftentimes, many times, what happens internal gets out, right? People can go online in an instant and complain about what's happening at their employer of choice, and so they can that news gets out very quickly and can be in the public eye and part of the societal discourse very fast. So within employee communication, go back to this model, we're typically situated here within internal communications, but also it even relates to community relations because oftentimes you'll see employees in the community, active in the community, wearing T-shirts, running 5Ks and working for Habitat for Humanity. So we're going to come back to that because that turns out to be pretty important. The other thing that's really important, I'll come back to a common theme that we've gotten to is money, right? Employees are an important resource. And if we can connect with employees internally, it saves money, right? Because one of the biggest costs for any organization, any industry is employee turnover. So really important audience for us to think about in this organization society relationship. All right, real important concept I want to share with you. It's called the fundamental paradox. And the fundamental paradox basically goes like this. How can organizations appeal to individuals, right? How can they appeal to individuals? How can they appeal to individual needs for creativity, for meaning, for individuality, right, for flexibility, while getting employees to work in the organization's best interest, right? How do I appeal to you as an employee, but then make sure that you think organizationally, right? Think in the best interest of me as an organization, right? Of the leader, of the boss. So it's this constant paradox, the tension, it's a pull. There's the basic question. How can organizations balance individual and organizational needs? So what I want us to think about is that communication plays a role in helping to do that balance. And so let's look at some of those ways. The book talks about a couple of areas of internal communication that I'd like for us to focus on. The first is called management communication. So this is what we might think about as more one-on-one communication. This is where management is trying to communicate directly with employees. So it has two dimensions, task and relational, right? And so there's if I'm the boss, here are your tasks, your responsibilities, here's what I would like for you to do. Then there's the, hey, I care about you and your development piece. So there's the task and relational. And so management as an entity needs to be good, as a function needs to be good at both of those things. So think about a boss you've had that seemed to focus only on the work that you're supposed to be doing, not the person doing the work, right? So if you've ever experienced that, chances are you've seen what it's like when somebody's great at one of these, but then is not at the other. One concept I want to mention is leader-member exchange. And this is basically the way to think about balancing task and relational, right? The idea that the leader-member relationship is one of the most important relationships within any organization. And primarily it's because that is going to be the relationship that's trusted for sources of information, for role development. So let's imagine, for instance, you get a memo from management or somebody comes in and tells you something on behalf of management. What leader member exchange tells us is that you're actually going to go to your direct boss and ask him or her what that means for you and your work. So that leader member exchange relationship becomes a really important one in terms of the quality of information and the amount of information you get. It's also the primary relationship through which your roles develop, right? So a boss gives you a role, but then hopefully it comes to you and asks you to modify it a little bit and figure out if it's going to work for you and what are some things that you understand or don't understand. The worst thing you can do is be given a job description and say good luck. You don't see anybody for 6 months. So again, this is how organizations can build relationships internally to help make brand ambassadors for themselves. And we'll come back to that a little bit too. The second area, though, is what we call corporate information and communication systems. So if management communication is sort of a small circle, right, employees and management, this one is big, right? So this is where employees create, for instance, communication calendars, and they publish their information to all their employees, and they sort of cascade that down about decisions and information, events that are going on, those kind of things. So I think about this as keeping employees in the loop on a broad scale. So those are two important areas in terms of organizations communicating with important stakeholder, which is employees. The other thing, this is really even pretty simple, but just communication flow. You can have what we think of as top-down communication, which is all about the mission of the organization, the vision and where we're heading, policies, training kind of stuff, that what we're doing, what we're up to. But then you also want to have communication going upward as well, where it's focused on feedback and concerns. I have a picture up here of Bill Emerson, who was the CEO of Quicken Loans, and I don't know if he still does this, but when a few years back, he actually gave all of his employees his cell phone number. Right. And so he was open about wanting feedback and concerns. And so organizations need both. They need information that goes down. They also have to be able to get information, good and bad, up from employees. Well, one of the ways that this is possible or not is through the communication climate. And there's really two types of climate. There's an open climate, which we would consider to be warm. And then there's a climate of silence or a close, which we would refer to as kind of a chilly climate. It's cold. It's unpleasant. Bottom line is, this is about an internal environment of communication and information exchange between managers and employees. And this is formal stuff like the employee calendar. And it's also informal. Do you feel like you can go to your boss? So just think about that, right? Like places that you've worked, did you feel like it was open or closed, warm or chilly? And again, that plays a large role in terms of how organizations can kind of manage that paradox that we talked about as well. So when we think about these upward and downward communications, if you've got well-informed employees and you've got good interaction with management, right? So information is going down, but it's also coming back up. The research shows that that's going to lead to identification, which is a fancy word, but really all it is the extent to which you feel like you are one with the organization and you define yourself as the organization, right? So like when somebody talks about what you do, asks you what you do, you immediately talk about the organization, not just the profession. So you're going to sort of come, almost like you and the organization are one, right? You sort of refer to yourself as an employee there, and you signal your identification by wearing products and waving flags around and showing up for events and wearing the t-shirt proud, right? So you're sort of defining yourself, and that, as you can imagine, is amazing for an organization. And that is actually where it gets out into societal stakeholders, right? If corporate communication in organizations in society is all about relationships, we want the people that work for us to go out and talk about us and build relationships with the communities. That's really where that comes in, and is really, really pays big for organizations. Just like media, right? Just like we have employees that connect with the media intentionally, we want our other employees to be out talking about us as well. So then identification, what are some of the results, right? Turnover, higher morale, commitment, belongingness, control, right? Which if you're an employee may not be a good thing always, but for an employer, employees who identify usually think in line with the organization. And so they're a little bit easier to kind of make sure that we keep employees in line, if you want to think about that. So here's the takeaway. Here's the so what. Communication professionals set the conditions, right, to build identification through management communication, those information systems, and then employees to speak out and be heard and have through a warm communication climate. And then through doing that, we build relationships with our key stakeholder, which then they will go out and talk about the organization. And that's going to help us to build a positive reputation as a place where people want to work. One of the biggest goals of any organization is to be on one of those lists of the top places to work. And this is why, because it matters for reputation. Couple takeaways. First, media have a big influence on amplifying stories and reputation. Employees can be brand ambassadors in both audiences.